Come join us on the therapy couch, getting cozy with Rachel Elizabeth Seed, documentary, non-fiction storyteller, photographer. Her work's been supported by the Jewish Film Institute all the way through to Sundance Institute. Her film, A Photographic Memory, is what we'll be discussing. Come through.
Join us on this journey of creative exploration and personal growth.
Rachel, welcome to Filmmakers Therapy Pouch. That's a great start, Dami. Okay, so to the Filmmakers Therapy Couch. Welcome, Rachel. Rachel Seed, it's so great to have you. I feel like we've been in and out of each other's lives over the last 15 years, definitely before I had children. And so I really am so glad to see you again and to see that this time you have your project in completion, your film done and out there to the world. Welcome, Rachel. How are you?
Thank you so much. Yes, we have known each other for, it's been at least a decade, probably more. And yeah, I'm doing well. It feels good to, after being in the, darkness of post-production for so long, to finally be able to bring it out into the light and start to share it. So it's an exciting moment.
Well, I'm very excited to have you here. And this is Filmmakers Therapy Couch. It's for creative minds, healing, a safe space, all of that. But also a way for others to be able to share in the impact that other people like yourself are making. And so we're going to jump straight into it because your film, oh my goodness, A Photographic Memory. Please tell us about it. The title is exquisite. The film and the person behind the film is exquisite. So please tell us more.
Yeah, it's been a very long road full of twists and turns, both in the film, the producing of the film, things like fundraising, etc., and the personal experience of getting to know my mother over a decade of searching. I started it in 2011. And I was not a filmmaker at the time. I was a photographer and a writer. And one day I just realized that the story that I wanted to tell or that I needed to tell and the experience of getting to know my mother would best be done in a film format. And so I sort of took the call from wherever it came from, the ethers, to make it into a film. Because my mother had left behind a huge body of work, writing, photography, audio recordings, film. And I was like, what am I going to do with all this stuff? And how much of her is left in these materials? So that was sort of the trip that I started in 2011. And I'm just now wrapping up finally after so many years.
What an amazing trip. And, if we go back to the reason behind this film, the fact that, you lost your mother at 18 months old, I just feel like there is so much courage in the fact that you decided to make the film and really go there and explore. Like, what was that for you, especially having to come to terms with the fact that so many other people knew your mom more than you got to know your mom?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, I could see how it would seem courageous from the outside. I think from my perspective, because I was already in nonfiction storytelling, it was the only way that I knew how to get to know her. And that was part of it. The other part of it was that it sounds maybe a little woo-woo or whatever, but it was just an idea that came to me, like I said, kind of from another realm, that it was like something I had to answer, like a call that I felt like I had to answer. So in a way, I felt like I didn't give myself a choice. It was just like, this needs to be done. And it's going to be a hard road, perhaps. I didn't even think that far ahead. But it was just like, I have to do this thing. And it became this crazy obsession. And I remember thinking over the last year when it was almost the hardest part was just finishing it. And I thought to myself, like, I'm either going to die or I'm going to finish this film. And I have to finish the film because it felt like it was so hard that I honestly felt like this could kill me if I don't finish this film. And so I was just like, it was like, I must get to the top of the mountain.
Yeah.
And for those people out there who aren't filmmakers, like that's how difficult making a film can be sometimes.
Right. And now, how do you sustain yourself for a whole 10 plus years in creating a project that you really have so much passion about?
I think it was just really about like knowing in the deep inside that I couldn't quit, because there were many times where obviously quitting and not finishing the project would have been so much easier. And sort of recommitting to it over and over and over again. I guess that's maybe like what people say about marriage too. It's like, yeah, every day you have to choose this person. I felt like every once in a while when things got really hard, like there was no money coming in or people were quitting the project or whatever it was, I had to keep recommitting to it and knowing that I couldn't give up. And part of that too was just things like, I did a Kickstarter, so I had 500 people that gave me money, and I thought, well, I can't let all of them down, you know. Or then
Right.
when things advanced and we got support from like Sundance Institute or Chicken and Egg or whatever it was, then I just felt a responsibility, which was helpful to myself. It was like, okay, I'm also accountable to people who supported the film and believed in me. And I knew that quitting wasn't an option. But I can tell you there have been many, many times where I just kept dreaming about a vacation. Like, when am I going to get to go on an actual vacation? And like, you can't take a vacation when you're working on a feature film. It felt like that to me. And so,
Right. Yes. I mean, and then like you said, there's so many people who have like come around you to support you in this process. Congratulations, by the way, because it is very competitive out there.
thank you.
So, how easy was it to draw all of that funding? Was that the main thing that you did? And was there a process to it to sustain it over that period of time?
Um, well, I think like in addition to being a director, I'm also a producer, and I'm like this weird kind of person who enjoys this challenge, which seems impossible, of like finding money for a project. And so it was kind of like, okay, we're not going to let any stone go unturned. And so, and as a photographer and a writer, I had written a lot of grants in the past for other projects, which I had been pretty successful with. So I think I took that experience into the fundraising of this project. But I really had to start from ground zero because I wasn't a filmmaker. So I didn't have any connections in the film industry when I started, like zero. And I had just moved to New York City. And I remember Googling the day that I came up with the film idea. I Googled, how do I write a documentary budget? How do I write a documentary treatment? Because I had nobody to call. So it really was like learning as much as I could from the people around me. I built a group called the Brooklyn Documentary Club, partly because I wanted to be connected to a lot of filmmakers, so it became my film school in a way. I also was a part of Film Fatales, which is where you and I met. And so I really have to credit like the New York City film communities and how mutually supportive we have been of each other's work, of the filmmakers within the groups, which, by the way, is not the case for if you're a photographer, if you're other kinds of artists. You don't have, I haven't seen the same kind of support that the documentary filmmakers give each other. So I really have to credit the generosity and the experience of the other documentary filmmakers that shared, connections, information, and now I'm in a place where I feel like I can do that for other people. So that was a big part of it. But honestly, it was just like this crazy kind of like, I can't give up. And what are all the different possibilities? And starting small and just building on any success that we did have with fundraising.
That's amazing because I definitely feel that documentary filmmakers, we are some of the best, of course. But, in to your point that we're good at creating that community because a lot of the times we're just adventurers, investigators, explorers, and want to know,
Curious.
yeah, curious, creative, and really want to know the ins and outs, was just nosy basically. So it's like, let me ask you 101 questions. But
Absolutely.
yeah, and as you said, it's different in photography. But how are the mediums of storytelling different? What have you found in that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I probably was a little naive when I came to filmmaking, thinking like, oh, I'm a photographer and I could, easily be a filmmaker. But the fact is, like, filmmaking is a lot more difficult in certain ways than photography, because with photography, you can be totally by yourself, just with a camera, and you could take one amazing image, win a contest, put it on a website. With film, it takes longer, it involves more people, it's generally more expensive. And so it's just a very different process. So it's funny because I got into filmmaking because my dad had given me a 5D Mark II, Canon 5D Mark II, which it was 2009, and I was a photographer then. And photographers at that time were so excited because this camera could also shoot video. It was the first DSLR to do that. And it just blew open this whole world for photographers. We're like, oh, wow, we can make films now. Meanwhile, like, this camera was terrible with sound. It was terrible with camera shake. It wasn't really made for films, but as photographers, we all thought we could do this. So that was kind of my entry point in. And I used that camera to make my film for the first few years, actually, which is funny now when people look back and think like, oh, it's such a basic camera for filmmaking. But so yeah, I would say, like, it was the naivete, I think, that actually gave me the confidence to go forward and try to make a film.
I love
And
that.
probably the ignorance was good at the time, because if I knew everything that I would have to learn, then it might have been more daunting. So
Right. Being able to then have the DSLRs afterwards and realizing that, wait, you can get a camera quite cheaply and then like get all of your accessories. It just really opened it wide for anyone who'd been wanting to make these documentaries or starting to make the documentaries, but like relying on just the grants and the resources. They, suddenly were able to take it into their own hands, and actually shoot as well as direct. And so
yeah.
clearly that's what you did because it's a very personal story. What were how do you see yourself in this film? Are you the director, producer, camera person? Did you make that decision because of the intimacy that you wanted? Like, how did you go about sort of crewing up for this whole thing?
I would say, to be honest, a little haphazardly because I didn't really have a plan when I first started. It did help that I could just pick up the camera, and one of my first subjects was my father, who I interviewed constantly throughout the 10 years. But yeah, I think it was just like, okay, I have a camera, I can start. But I did, my first official shoot was actually in Paris at Henri Cartier-Bresson's apartment, where I interviewed his wife, Martine Frank. So that was a pretty big jumping off point. Like, okay, let's just dive into the deep end and interview the most famous photographer in the world, be in his apartment with his wife. And I hired two people sight unseen from Mandy.com for that shoot. And it was a little bit of a disaster, to be perfectly honest. I mean, you wouldn't know that seeing the film, but behind the scenes, it was a bit of a disaster. At that point, I was like, okay, it's much better to hire people when you get a recommendation from somebody. That's one of those learning experiences. Like, okay, it's good to know what you're getting into with the crew. So
Well, I love the fact that you just dove right in. Like everything that you said so far really, shows to me that you're a determined person, but also someone who just goes for it because, and maybe like the naivety is the bliss right there because, just the fact that you're picking up the camera, you're doing it, you're starting to tell this story. It's almost like you were out of your own way because a lot of documentary filmmakers find that they have to go through, this process of the treatment. What is the story I'm going to tell? What does it look like as a thesis? And how is it going to make an impact in the outreach? Now submit, right?
right.
Whereas you picked up your camera and you're like, I'm telling this story regardless. And so when did you get to that point where you're like, okay, this needs to be constructed in the way that the industry would like to see on paper as pitch decks, as treatments, as budgets and all of that, and was it a seamless thing? And and I guess I'm asking like, for the documentary filmmaker in my head who is so used to the step by step, like how you
Yeah.
might somehow hack that.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. As I'm sure you know, like when you apply for grants, they require you to write a lot of specific things, like what's the synopsis, why are you doing this, what's the director's statement, et cetera, et cetera. And when you do that, you're forced to do it. You have to think about why you're doing it. And I'm not sure I would have thought about it that clearly if it wasn't for having to write those grants. So that actually, like, as annoying as those are sometimes, that process did help me hone in on why I was doing it. But then also, two more things. One is that when I had the idea to make the film, it came to me in a flash after I had heard my mother's voice for the first time since I was a baby, sitting in one of the photographer's office, Cornell Kappa, and I was hearing her interview the photographers. And it was such a multi-dimensional experience for me, hearing her voice, hearing the photographers, that I was like, this is more than just a photography project. This is more than, an article or whatever. It felt like a film. And so I always went back to that moment whenever I would question, what is this about? Why am I doing this? It was always about how much of her can I find in her work? And it was because I had this profound moment of connecting with her through her voice and remembering her voice that I was like, there's something to this. There's something mystical, mysterious, whatever it is. Like, she's still alive in these interviews. I can hear the vibration of her voice on the 7-inch audio reels from the 1970s. And I feel like I'm in the room with her and the photographers. And it was that moment that always guided me throughout the whole process, no matter what I was going to write about it. And I will say the moment I realized that was when Tabitha Jackson, who used to run the Sundance Documentary Institute, and then she ran the festival for a while. When I did the Sundance Edit Labs in 2019, she had all the filmmakers sitting in a circle, and everybody had to go around and say, what was the original reason you're making this film? I don't remember her exact question. It was like, what's at the core of what this film is about? Why are you making this film? Don't listen to the buyers, to the distributors, to all these other voices outside of yourself. Why are you making this film? And I always came back to that moment. And because of that, I always would go back to that moment whenever I was writing something or thinking about, am I getting off track? Like, is someone telling me what to do that's not exactly the film I want to make? It has to resonate with that moment. And so I would say advice for any documentary filmmaker is like, always try to remember, like, what is this core reason, your core initial spark for making the project? And can you always go back to that to make sure you don't lose your own vision? Because I think there have been many times where I'm like hearing all these voices of people around me saying, oh, you should do this, you should do that. But you always have to ask yourself, is this actually the film that I want to make as a director? Because I think you can get off track if you lose sight of your own, that core reason.
Absolutely. And, this is a personal story to you. And, tell us about, well, the synopsis really, and what the story is about, but also why you decided to put yourself in the film.
Well, I realized at a certain point, again, probably from writing all these grants, that the film is about me trying to find and have this relationship with my mother that I never had, and trying to understand what I missed or how I could build this relationship with her after she's dead and gone. And so the question is like, can I do it? Is it even possible to have a relationship with someone you don't remember? Obviously a parent, in this case my mother. And I don't want to give away what happens in the film, but I was fairly successful in finding what I was looking for. And I didn't know when I started if I would find it or what extent I would be able to build this relationship with her. So I think for me, one of the gifts of the film, and I'm seeing it after talking to audience members, that people start to see for themselves that it's possible to have a relationship with somebody who's gone. And to me, that's like, I get emotional thinking about it. It's one of the most meaningful things that the film offers.
So beautiful. So beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And so, in what way has it been a healing process for you?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think just discovering that I could have a relationship with my mom. So, whereas before when I started, there was this huge feeling of emptiness and a feeling of like, I can't do anything else with my life until I find this relationship. And maybe that sounds crazy to people who grew up with both their parents, don't understand the feeling of like needing to know your parents. I think anyone who's either adopted or lost a parent young probably could relate. But it just felt like this thing that I had to do at all costs. Like I gave up a lot of things in my life. I gave up an MFA program, relationships, like so many things to get to this point in the process. And it was kind of something that was unconscious, an unconscious search, I guess. Uh, but yeah, I feel like it was immensely healing to get to the other side of that process and now feel like I don't have the same urge anymore. I don't need to look for my mother. So even though she's not physically present, I do feel like she's with me and I have like the strength of that connection. And I feel it was incredibly healing to go through that process. Let's honestly, like most people wouldn't be able to go through that process the way I did because most people don't have a huge archive that their parent created that has sound and pictures and movies and all this stuff. So I understand too. It feels like a really big gift that I was able to do that because I had so many things that she left behind.
Wow, and I'm so glad that you were able to find what you were looking for. And it seems from the trailer especially, like in doing so, you've created a cathartic moment for all of these people who were able to get to know your mom and be behind her lens. And one of the artists, photographers, how he mentions that you are so much like your mom, and and even in your persona and your character. How did it feel to find that connection as well through all of these other people that knew her?
I mean, sometimes it's weird because here's this guy that, spent a couple afternoons with my mom and he knows more about what she was like than I do, right? So there's a weird feeling of like all these peripheral people, yes, they're great photographers. They're, her ex-boyfriend, her best friends. But they were also generous in sharing about her. So I do feel like I was able to really get to know her through that. But yeah, it's a weird feeling when someone's like, oh, you remind me of this person that you don't even remember. Because it's like, what do you do with that information? It's a strange disconnect. But now that I feel like I know her much better, it doesn't bother me as much.
I have no memory of my mother. She died when I was very young. But when I discovered her interviews a few years ago, I got to hear her voice for the first time since I was a baby.
The first thing is, would you just introduce yourself?
My name is Henri Cartier-Bresson.
My name is Bruce Davidson. I'm Conor Kappa. I'm a photographer.
My name is Lisette Model.
I needed to know more about my mother, so I set out on a journey to revisit the photographers and to find out more about the mother I never knew.
And I'm so happy that all of us now will get to know your mother as well. And then, some people have already been like, had the juiciness by going to True False Festival. So tell us about that. Like, first of all, congratulations, a major film
Thank
festival.
you.
In all of the press, is it like the Hollywood Report, like all of the spaces and places where you want to have your work talked about. And so it's happening for you. Like, tell us about that whole experience, how you got yourself prepared for it, and, where you see your film heading to next.
Well, I always, like, people would always ask me, like, when's the film going to be done? Or how's it going? Or, which when you're 10 years into a project, you don't want to keep answering those questions. But But at a certain point, I realized like the only way I'm going to finish this film is when I absolutely have to, and I need a deadline. And so I'm like, basically, True False was that deadline because the film wasn't totally finished, but it was like it was close to being finished. And so when we got in, my boyfriend, who's also been my editor for the last year and change, who's done an amazing job. His name is Christopher Stout. When we got in, it was like, okay, we have 4 weeks till we have to deliver it. And I was just grateful to have that deadline. So that's what we did. We're like, okay. And then I thought about it like a festival cut because the film is actually not 100% finished yet, but it's very close. But now I feel proud and happy to send it out. Whereas for a long time, people say like the film should be totally finished before you submit it to festivals. And I do think there's some truth to that. But for whatever reason, I couldn't fully finish the film at that point. So I'm really grateful that True False took a chance on a cut that was not 100% finished. And then we were able to finish it. But I will say for like festivals, like, the big ones that everybody wants to get into, I think it would have definitely been better if I was submitting the current cut I have versus the one that I actually did submit to them, which
So
is
can
not.
you now do that? Can you now resubmit because it's a different draft?
I submitted to Sundance 3 times already, the last 3 years, which already takes some chutzpah, as we say in Yiddish, which is about equivalent to like balls or something like that. But yeah, most of them don't accept a second round. Some of them do. But at this point, we've already premiered and we're already well on our way in the festival circuit. So maybe for my next film, I'll think a little differently about how I go about it. But I think for this one, we're already on the track we're on. So probably can't resubmit again.
But I'm glad that you're telling us about the journey to submitting because all of this effort that you've put in, I'm like, this better be on all of the platforms. It better be
Yeah,
sold
right?
nationally, distribution deals, sales agents, the works, and then everyone asking me, what am I working on next? Like,
Yeah.
because you've a decade is a decade plus, right?
Yeah.
So and so you've poured into it and now it's like what's coming back out, and clearly it's the impact that it's going to have for others, and especially in this conversation around grief and loss, and storytelling. But for you as well, I'm thinking about the business of filmmaking, like how you then sort of take back and get the reward, the financial reward that we all deserve, in
Yeah.
our art.
Yeah. So right now, the way I'm thinking about it is I am very interested in community screenings, educational screenings, and festival screenings as a way to earn a living for the next year. So I hadn't actually heard that many filmmakers talk about that previously. Like in every stage of my process, because it's my first film, I'm learning as I go for that stage. Because you don't have the energy to learn about the whole thing when you're making it, because it takes everything you have just to make the damn film. So now that I'm in the festival screening phase, I'm learning like, oh, you should ask for screening fees. I'm learning that there's certain educational circuits that you can actually earn a living. I'm also learning that's a full-time job just to write these emails and try to keep up with them. So I'm looking at possibly hiring somebody to help me do that. So that's my current plan for the next year. But then I also I would love to start a workshop or class, like a online class, maybe in person, to help other filmmakers fundraise. Also maybe one for personal or autobiographical storytelling, because it has its own unique set of challenges. And it's a very challenging form of documentary filmmaking. So I'd love to take whatever I've learned in these areas and help other filmmakers. So those are two of my ideas, but I also, I want to direct and produce more things. So, but at the moment, my hands are so full with this other stuff. I am producing a couple of other projects, but this is my main focus at this moment.
Wow. So would you say that's your main you know, if you had to pick one of the roles, would producing be the thing that everyone should, you know, come and bombard you with, like, Rachel, we need to produce our project? Or because, you know, that does the producing, I mean, obviously a lot of producers, there are a lot of producers, but there are a lot of different types of producers. And so,
Absolutely.
you know, people are like, oh, I'm a producer. But then, you
Right.
know, there's creative producing, there's, you know, line producing, there's all these different types of
There's so
producers.
many different, it's been such
Right.
an interesting learning experience working with lots of different kinds of producers. Because I remember like asking, and I will answer that question, but like talking about producers is interesting to me. Because I remember at one point I was like, what does a producer do? Like when I really didn't know anything. And the answer is like, yeah, so many different things, and different ones do different things and have their things they're really good at, and things they're not as good at, things they want to do, things they don't want to do. And the word is just used generally, but there should be like much more nuance in those kinds of producers. But I personally, I feel like there's two sides in my brain. There's a side that loves the creative part, the writing, the directing, and that's me as like a, you know, creative person. But then there's and the storytelling and figuring out what the story is. But then there's a part of me that loves like business and finding like ways to find funding and finding ways to connect with people and maximize opportunities for, you know, distribution, whatever. So I feel like they're both something I love doing, but it's just a different side of my brain, and I want to do both. But after directing for so long this particular film, I feel like right now me taking a break is me producing other things, because that's easier for me than the creative like hashing out and the figuring out. And I just need like tiny bit of time off of that, but then I want to direct more stuff.
Oh, I love that. And I definitely hear you. I'm more on the other side where you know, the creativity is like, you know, in my sleep. The producing is, oh my gosh, like pulling teeth, like, oh, anyway. So but it's interesting that we have to work both muscles. And
Yeah,
you know, and I also think what we're saying here as well is that we should also rely on the skills of the other people that we know, the other creatives who are more fortified in certain things. And
absolutely.
yeah, and use that as a collaborative way. The model has changed. I mean, even Martin Scorsese recently said, like, you know, Hollywood we've got to redefine this, and it's for the younger generations to do so. And so I feel like we're the buffers that have been in the old world, and now this new world that's been created, we're able to help people navigate that. So I look forward to seeing you, you know, on the trail, helping those and impacting others as they tell their stories.
Her amazing drive was tempered by her feeling that her life could be short.
She's looking very youthful there, isn't she?
That was just a few months before she died. When my mother interviewed you, was it in here?
Yeah. I would sit here and Sheila would sit there. You have a lot of your mother in you. You seem to have the ability to make me say outrageous things.
Photography is a universal language.
And a lot of people I've spoken to who want to tell their stories, they're fearful of seeing themselves on camera, and that really is the only thing that's stopping them. How did you deal with that? Was that in your frame of reference at all? And what things did you have in place just to make sure that you committed to being truthful to to what was needed to be included?
I would say like the being on camera was not so much an issue for me, but the hardest part of the whole film for me was writing the narration and being intentional about what is the story I'm telling, and even sharing like really emotional or intimate details of my own story. That was the hardest part for me, hands down. And if there was anything that would ever have made me quit, which nothing would have made me quit, but if there's anything, it would have been the narration, because it was just brutally hard. And the reason why was that every time I would show versions of the film, I would get the same feedback. Well, we want to know more about Rachel. What does Rachel feel? And I would get so irritated by this feedback, because maybe the truth is I didn't actually know how I felt like, how do you know, how do you feel about growing up without your parent? I mean, how do you even put that into words, you know? And I honestly didn't really know. And so I had to dig so deep, and I had to keep going back to the drawing board. I had to keep rewriting it, and nobody ever was satisfied. So that was the most challenging part by far. And I never really set out to make a film about myself. I was always behind the camera, right? Like, as I was a photographer, I would tell other people's stories. It was not natural to me to tell my own story at all. And it was incredibly hard. And I would talk to anyone who was thinking about doing it and make sure they know like what they're getting themselves into. Because it does take a lot of courage, I think, to dig within yourself and even know what you're trying to say, but then also sharing it with the public. And I remember I heard a filmmaker, a film that I love called Tarnation. Have you heard of that film? You know that film?
Yeah, great film. Mm-hmm.
Love that film by Jonathan Coet. And I heard a podcast with him like 2 years ago where he was like, I had no idea that 18 years after I made the film, people would still be like stigmatizing me for some of the stuff I shared in the film. And it was like because his mom was mentally ill, and you know, it's a very hard story. Beautiful, beautiful, affecting film. But when I heard his podcast, I was like, oh shit, like what if maybe I shouldn't say these things, or like what if I have the same experience where years later I regret something I put in the film. So it's like in this day and age, you make something public and it's with you for life. So it is a lot, not to scare people, but it is a lot to think about and to be so intentional about. And my story like is not that hard of a story to share because my mother died, you know, she wasn't like a terrible person, or, you know, there's nothing I'm revealing about my family that's like going to stain the family legacy, you know. So there are stories out there that are a lot more challenging. Like, for example, Strong Island by Yancey Ford. That's a wonderful, amazing film and brutal. I mean, like, so I put myself in Yancey's shoes and I was like, this must be so hard to share this story and to access their own pain, you know, and be able to put that into a film. So yeah, it's definitely not for the faint of heart. And a lot of people fictionalize their stories because they don't want to be identified. So yeah, it's definitely, there's some challenges there. But for people who don't want to see themselves in the film, I mean, it's not for everybody. Like, I'm not an actor, but, you know, not everybody wants to be in a film or should be in a film or can be in a film. Mm-hmm. If you're so uncomfortable at it and you can't get over it, then maybe there's another way to tell that story, you know.
And you know, maybe to your point, there are ways to get yourself into, say, character or the personification of yourself in order to deal with it. Did you find yourself acting as you when do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's really hard to strike that balance. I will say, like, one of the most fun parts of maybe the most fun shoot I did was recreating my mother's interviews with the photographers. So I play my mother in the film, and we hired actors off of Craigslist. But I think, you know, that was really fun because I got to like play my mother. So that was like a really enjoyable, and it was silent. I mean, we don't use any audio from the shoot in the film. But yeah, I would say like the times I felt the most nervous was when I was like going to meet with like the great photographers that my mother had met with, you know, and some of them were my own photography idols, like Bruce Davidson. So I just felt like kind of like I'm not worthy, you know, at the time. Plus it was really early in the film shoots, and so I still didn't really have the confidence of like what I was totally doing. So that I would say was like I was self-conscious during those shoots. But otherwise, when it was like my mom's best friend or my dad, I just enjoyed the process of really asking the questions I was curious to find out. And I didn't really feel so much like I was acting during those shoots, but I did feel like definitely nervous with like Martine Frank or Bruce Davidson giving me a whole day of their time.
Woo, that's beautiful. That's really beautiful. And so how are you maintaining yourself, like your self-care? Do you have a morning routine, and all of that?
That's a great question. And it was a very important question. I do have a morning routine. Every day I wake up, I make coffee, I do yoga. Um, on a perfect day, I also write. I do like morning pages. If anyone's heard of the Artist's Way, just stream of consciousness, 3 pages, and and then I also go for a walk with my partner every morning. And we live in LA, and we make sure to pick at least one lemon off a neighbor's tree because in LA, if the lemons come over the like public, like the sidewalk, you're allowed to pick them, any of the citrus trees. So we have a bowl of lemons and we just collect a lemon every day. To me, that's part of it. And then also for the most part, I was in therapy the whole time. And maybe like 3 years ago, it became this big movement in the documentary world where people were saying you should add a line item in your budget for therapy. And so I did that. And I started being able to pay for therapy through through the film budget. So I think that's a cool way to go too.
Oh, that's a great tidbit right there. Did you hear that, everyone? I do remember Ava DuVernay speaking on this, on some of her productions and bringing in, especially on the 13th,
Oh yeah, they must have
having,
really, yeah. And I
yeah,
think like you can only really get away with a line item on your budget for therapy if the subject of your film somehow requires, some heavy lifting emotionally, which a lot of documentaries do, probably most of them. But I would say, yeah, that's great, and it is needed.
absolutely. And let's talk about that just briefly. This idea of what's appropriate in the storytelling, and you were dealing with a sensitive topic. I know it was about you, but we're talking right now about the whole Wendy Williams, and a lot of people feel that she's been exploited. She has dementia, and her cognitive ability is slightly strained. What do you think in terms of like the documentary space and how we deal with our ethics and morals?
I think that's an ongoing challenging question. My only experience so far really has been telling my family's story. I mean, I have made short films about other subjects as well, but they were generally quite positive stories, so it wasn't like exposing too much of anybody. But I think for me, like I would just check in with my own gut on whether it was ethical or not. And so in my case, like one of my questions was like, I'm using my mother's journals. Would she have wanted me to share some of the things I'm sharing? And where do I draw the line? Because there definitely were things in her journals that I didn't feel comfortable sharing with the world. So in my case, which is very unconventional, and maybe nobody else would do what I did, but I would actually have a conversation with her in my head, or whatever you want to call it, and I would ask her if she was okay with it, and then I would hear her response, and then I would follow her advice. So that's what I did, but I don't expect most other people are going to
I
talk
love
to.
that you did that. I love that you did that. That's
But yeah, I
really
think it's a hard question in general for people, to what is that line ethically? Because to tell a great story, oftentimes you do have to address the most difficult things or things that people are uncomfortable sharing. And if you wash out all those details, it's probably going to be boring. So I think it is a huge question. I don't really have the answer to that. Maybe somebody who worked on a film that's more about like people outside their family navigating that. But I think just having compassion, I guess, and coming from the heart, making the decisions from the heart. Like, would you want this thing told about your own story if it was your story? Maybe that's a way to go about it.
well. This has been a really great conversation, and I really appreciate your vulnerability, especially. And so excited about your film. And so, tell us a bit about, as we begin to wrap, like where people can find you, what's next for the journey of this film, distribution, etc. And yeah, until we catch up again next time to sing your praises.
Well, thank you so much. I love this podcast too. It's great. I love being a part of it. So I would say we are starting to do like a bigger festival circuit. We're going to be heading to Full Frame Festival next month, and we're going to be going to Hot Docs in Toronto. We're going to the San Francisco Jewish Film Festival in the summer, and the Maryland Film Festival in Baltimore coming up. But yeah, we're just really, it feels like early days in the whole festival push, but those are the ones coming up. And then we don't have distribution yet, and we're, just starting to look for that. And then on Instagram, as we go along, I'm posting, every update, and that's at SOIGNESONG. Is the handle. So it's SOIGNESONG. And yeah, that's where I'll be posting all the updates of everything that we're doing.
We love it. We can't wait to keep updated. Is there anything else that you want to share with us that I've missed that you might want people to know?
I think you did a really great job of asking really meaningful, important questions. Maybe it's because you're a great documentary filmmaker yourself, and that's what we do. We have to get to the heart of everything. So you're a natural. But I feel like, I guess my only, advice is like just the importance of community, as we talked about earlier. Like you and I wouldn't be sitting here today if it wasn't for Film Fatales together. And like the strength of the relationships that you build within your creative community, for me, that's like one of the absolute most important things in making a film. Obviously, the rest of it is very hard work, but that support of the community is just like, to me, totally vital. So I would say like put energy and effort and time into your relationships, and not just so you can make a film, obviously, but yeah, I'm grateful for those communities in New York, the Brooklyn Dot Club, Film Fatales, the Video Consortium. It's a little bit more like networky, commercial maybe, but also you still find relationships there. So yeah, that's pretty much what I would say.
Absolutely love it. And yeah, the beauty in relationships, because I'm so glad that I got to meet you and that we're in each other's spheres. So I can't wait to see your film, and we'll continue to celebrate you. Thank you so much for being here, Rachel, on the Therapy Couch, Filmmakers Therapy Couch.
Woo! Thank you. This is wonderful. So great to see you and talk to you. And I'm excited for all the next sessions on the Therapy's Couch with the other filmmakers you meet.
Subscribe now to the Filmmakers Therapy Couch podcast.